Hello and welcome to 5-Year Club video number 250. Another uplifting article tonight. Record global debt. What it means for the next crisis. And let's just move this over a bit. Make it easier to read. Maybe shrink me a little bit. All right, let's see how that goes. All right. When it comes to managing debt, it seems the last financial crisis wasn't enough of a lesson. Global debt is on track to hit new highs this year, according to Vitor Gasper, Director of Fiscal Affairs at the International Monetary Fund. In 2016, global debt hit a record 225% of world wealth, according to the IMF's Global Debt Database, which tracks 190 countries from 1950 to the present day. That figure measures debt taken on by companies, governments, you, and me. Global debt is very high, Gasper said. The headline number is 164 trillion in 2016. The indication that we have after 2016 is that in nominal dollar terms, that has continued to grow. Debt is a double-edged sword. It's fueling global growth at a time of stagnant wages. But as the 2008 financial crisis illustrated so painfully, when a bubble does eventually burst, the losses ripple far and wide, and we just don't know enough about how all that global debt is linked. China is a major concern, the Bank of England's governor, Mark Carney, told the BBC this week that in terms of international financial risk, China is top of the list. China is a great source of growth for the global economy. It's an absolute economic miracle. Lots of positives, Carney said. At the same time, their financial sector has developed very rapidly and has made many of the same assumptions that were made in the run-up to the last financial crisis. The Chinese are savers, said Freya Beamish, chief Asian economist at Pantheon Microeconomics. Their wealth actually contributed to the last financial crisis by pumping liquidity into global markets. Before the financial crisis, China was able to effectively export its savings to other countries, Beamish explains. The result is that global interest rates received a downward pressure, and consumers, particularly in the United States, were able to borrow beyond what they could sustain. Since the 2008 crisis, China's debt has come home to roost in its mushrooming shadow banking system, which operates outside the scrutiny of regular banking. The fear is no one knows how Chinese debt is being invested or managed. People get concerned about Chinese debts, particularly because the shadow banking sector is particularly shadowy, Beamish says. People get concerned about Chinese debts partly because the shadow banking sector is particularly shadowy, Beamish said. The other aspect going forward is the Fed is raising interest rates. And when interest rates are going up, it's now China in terms of the major global economies that is exposed. In other words, if enough of that Chinese domestic debt has been pumped not into sound investments, but into white elephants, then that debt could lead to crisis. And when China sneezes, the world catches a cold. Beamish says Beijing could limit the damage of any financial crisis internally by using its savings. It still has resources internally to be able to clean up debt, even if debt is 20% of GDP, Beamish said. That's one thing that's very different about China compared to Argentina or Turkey. But for the rest of the world, a Chinese crisis could be much more damaging. The major economies that would be affected would be on the commodities side, the capital goods exporters, all of those that have been dependent on China's rapid growth, Beamish said. Like Australia, even Germany, which is very dependent on exports to China. Potentially, Japanese financial institutions might have an exposure to financial distress in China. The IMF's Gasper, and let's move this over. Okay, the IMF's Gasper said China is making progress in trying to wean its economy off credit, and that most advanced economies are also beginning to pay down their debt. The question is whether they're doing it fast enough. While he says it's difficult to define a dangerous level of debt, the IMF's advice is to pay it down while things are good. It is in periods of growth that it is important to build a buffer, Gasper said. Research does show countries that do have these buffers do better. Whether you're a person, a company, or a country, we're more dependent than ever on debt-fueled growth. The trick is to find a balance between growth and crisis. All right, let's just think about this in general. Okay, because I think some of these numbers, they're so big, 164 trillion, 225% of world wealth as global debt. And the other thing is that, you can't really say that the globe acts the same as an individual, right? Because an individual has other people they can interact with, but a globe, it's all that is everything. There's no other globe to interact with to manipulate things. Well, what is debt? Debt is a promise to pay someone in the future. And you're planning on paying them the principal of the debt, which apparently is, say, 225% of world wealth, plus some kind of interest on top of that. And the total amount that you pay back over time, who knows? It could be double the debt, depending upon how it's amortized on, what, if it's a short-term or a long-term debt, that kind of thing. But fundamentally, the problem with debt is that this promise to pay people in the future saps your money flow in the future. It saps your income in the future. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is when you have a debt, you are expecting someone to pay you. When you have given someone a credit. So when you own some debt, you're expecting someone to pay you. And you may need that incoming money to pay your own debt. And so debt not only has this aspect that it requires you to pay someone in the future, but it also links people together in terms of their economic outcomes. And that's what was said in this article, is that we don't know all the ways that these different things are linked. And so the presence of the debt makes the financial analysis more complicated. And of course, the greater the debt, the more complicated the financial analysis. I mean, in general, you can say that the higher this percentage of debt is to world wealth, the dimmer the future. Of course, it's a little different in the sense that, this debt isn't always going to be paid, right? If there's a financial crisis, people are going to default on that debt. But defaulting on the debt, again, because of these linked relationships, when you default on the debt, that causes somebody else to default on their debt. And at the end of the day, like we discussed in the article, 2 or 3 days ago, defaulting on these debts and these relationships kind of collapsing, that hurts productivity overall because people have to reset into something new. And that's why they said that the GDP had taken 7 percentage points of hit, I think they said. And, that's quite a bit of money gone forever. So, yeah, then it talks about China, and I think we've discussed China before, but this has been said in other places. And I'm trying to remember the book that I was reading about that mentioned China's shadow banking system, and I can't quite remember it. It might have been a book about the collapse of the dollar, the coming collapse of the dollar. But yeah, there are a lot of investment funds in China that keep rolling over, and the money just stays in there. But because it keeps rolling over, nobody knows if the money is even still there in a lot of cases. And so it's kind of it's really ripe for fraud. It's the kind of system where, with no oversight, if you just keep letting it go, why wouldn't people start to take some from the pot? That's kind of the nature of the beast in the financial industry. So the worry, at least globally, with this debt is that all of these relationships that are created by the debt and all of these obligations to pay in the future, if something happens in China where, say the Chinese government has to step in and handle their own stuff eternally with savings. Okay, fair enough. But that could also mean that China's government cuts back expenditures on other things, which, as it said before, when China sneezes, the world gets a cold. That could lead to, fewer payments to, I don't know, Vietnam for different types of goods. And if that happened, then perhaps Vietnam would default on some of its debt. And if Vietnam defaults on some of its debt, then, again, this kind of spidering out of consequences. It's not a question, like the article says, it's not a question of if this is going to happen. It's a question of when. And if you read through some of these books on sovereign debt, on financial crises, it's very clear that in human civilization for thousands of years, and certainly in the last several hundred years, countries default over and over again, and financial crises happen over and over again. And I was born in 1984, so I've been able to see the kind of 92 crappy economy in the U.S. That was kind of the first thing that I had any awareness of because I was only 8 years old. And then I got to see the tech crash in 2000, but I was still in high school, so I was a bit removed from it. And then, of course, closer to adulthood, right after I graduated college, I got to see the 2008, big financial crash. And now it's 10 years later, 2018. And I'm just like, I'm waiting for the next one because this is definitely happening. This is not like a fiction. This is, when you actually read the history, you realize this is going to be like financial crash number, I don't know, 100 in the Western world or something like that. It's just, they happen. It's like breathing's a part of life, or respiration, maybe more accurately, is a part of certain types of life. Anyway, it's just, it's a social phenomenon, and we need to be prepared for it. Preferably we would also try to prepare as a country. So preferably when you went to vote for your local leaders, when your state leaders, your city leaders, your federal leaders, debt pay down would be a priority when you're looking at candidates and you're thinking about who am I going to vote for. But this isn't a political channel, and it's not like I've got anybody to endorse. I think everyone's done a pretty crappy job at it. I'm just bringing up the issue because the article's about it and we're talking about debt. Yep. Okay, so record global debt, what it means for the next financial crisis, it means it's going to be bad. It means that there are going to be fewer sources of money to bail out the U.S. when things go wrong. And so, we thought that the 2008 recession was bad. The next one's going to be worse. True facts. All right, well, that is the end of video number 250. The other thing I wanted to mention is with this global debt, if someone owes you money in the future, you have a contract for it, and that contract has an amount of value. Because you could, in theory, sell that contract to somebody else, and then the debtor would pay that other person. The presence of this debt, 225% of world wealth, not only does it mean an obligation of certain people to pay in the future, not only does it mean a linking of people together in relationships that are fragile, but it also pumps up asset prices. Because, like if you look in my neighborhood, all these houses that are selling for so much money, people are buying those with mortgages, with debt. And the more debt that's pumped into the system, the more home buyers are using debt to buy homes, it's going to push those home prices higher. And so there's something else that happens here, is that when this debt collapses, at the same time that you aren't receiving payments from, your bonds or something, if you're a creditor, where people owe you money, the assets that you own, stocks, homes, things, all that stuff drops in value too. And so now if you have debt, you can't sell your stuff for as much money to pay off that debt. And the phrase I've heard is it's imaginary wealth. Debt creates an illusion of wealth, even for people who do not have any debt. If you have zero debt but you own a home and you're just looking at your home value because of the sales prices in the area and you're thinking, wow, part of that home value is an illusion that's supported by the temporary debt situation around the world. And when the financial crisis happens, when the shit hits the fan, that wealth is going to evaporate, and you better have something else. That's what it comes down to. We've discussed, certainly on this channel, diversification. This is a reason for it. When the shit hits the fan, not all asset prices are going to drop the same amount, and you don't want to be holding only the asset that drops the most. You want to be holding a basket of assets so that you avoid the biggest hit. You're not going to avoid a hit entirely, but you want to avoid losing absolutely everything and taking the biggest hit and then freaking out and selling what remains and then missing the bounce and then just having nothing. All right, just wanted to say that about asset prices and wealth. That is it for 5 Year Club, video number 250. I hope you enjoyed it and have a fabulous evening.